all these, so if you miss class, it's on YouTube. Bede's life falls in the middle of what are commonly called the Dark Ages. Okay? Why the Dark Ages? What died out? The light of classical learning, the light of Rome and Greece, and you enter the Dark Ages, so-called, before you have the Middle Ages, which are still somewhat dark, and then the Renaissance. Okay? The people who coined Middle Ages and Dark Ages were the Renaissance thinkers and writers. Why? Because they had overly inflated egos. They thought of themselves as the new bright lights. Everybody who came before them lived in darkness. Okay? All you have to do is turn to, this picture of a golden belt buckle, okay, discovered in Sutton Hoo, England in 1939. This thing dates from about the same days or same years as Bede. Okay? It's actually early 7th century. It's in the 600s. Okay? But if you look at this picture closely in your book, where you see, man, my eyes are freaking out on me. Where you see the little black dots, that's not just little black dots. It's not like dirt or anything. Those are little tiny inlaid gemstones, okay, in this. And this is just about the size of this thing. It's solid gold. It's not gold plated. It's solid gold. And it's about a ½ inch thick. Okay? We can't reproduce this. That is, we don't have gem makers today with the skill to reproduce this. This is so-called, again, I'll get it later, Dark Age. Well, then turn from that and look at same kind of thing, Lindisfarne Gospels. Again, cannot be reproduced. Next page, Durham Cathedral. Okay? These are all done during the Dark Ages. So the term Dark Ages is a little bit loaded and pejorative. Okay? It's because of writers like Bede, scholars like Bede, that some of that knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome is transmitted. I mean, some of it does come later through the Renaissance. Much of it does come later through the Renaissance. But Bede and others keep it also going somewhat in the 7th and 8th centuries. I'm not going to talk about the Vikings and all that kind of stuff because I want to get straight to this. Now, when he writes the ecclesiastical history, he doesn't begin with the coming of Christianity. He begins with, the beginning of the world kind of a thing. And he begins with one of the myths that we have of the founding of Britain. Who founded Britain? A guy by the name of Brutus, who was a grandson of Aeneas, who is the son of Priam of Troy. In other words, the Brits, according to this myth, are Trojans. So they create this link back to one of the two great cultures, not of ancient Greece, because the Trojans weren't Greek. Okay? The Greeks defeated them. All right? But to one of these two great cultures. And we're going to see this theme all the way up into literature written in about 1400. So down in the Green Knight. Begins with, when Aeneas left Troy, blah, 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 and Brutus, etc. In fact, there's a big, long poem in the Middle Ages called The Brute, and it's about Brutus and the founding of the British people and such. But Bede does spend most of the time talking about the English church, which means what? Talking about kings and battles. Okay? From the beginning up until his time. Obviously, he dies fairly early, 735. There's a lot that goes on afterwards, which he doesn't deal with. Bede doesn't only write this, but he is kind of the first modern historian. He's the first modern historian because he goes about writing history the way modern historians do. Now, some of what Bede writes, a modern historian would say, well, it's just, fabulous. It's hogwash. I mean, we all know, modern scientific-minded people, miracles don't exist. Well, in Bede's modern scientific mind, in 731, miracles did exist. Why? Because Bede's mind allowed for the existence of God, whereas many modern, scientific historians would say God doesn't exist, etc. So mindset determines, where you go with that and such. What else? Bede does what modern historians do. He gets, one, eyewitness accounts. So he tries, when they are alive, when he's writing, he tries to get eyewitness accounts for some of the things he writes about. Two, if he can't get eyewitness accounts, he gets secondhand, where person A told person B, he'll talk to person B if person A is dead. Or, third way, if it's anything to do with Rome or the Pope, he tries to get hold of correspondence. For example, he actually gets letters from what today we would just call the Vatican. He does library research, in other words. He gets corroborating evidence. So it's not just one person say, he'll get 2 or 3 or 4. And if there's documentary evidence, he'll include that. Okay? He doesn't only write history. He writes biblical commentaries. He writes books about time. It's from Bede that we get. I'm going to use the old version, and then I'll throw in the modern version too. And we'll maybe talk about how the modern version is kind of silly. The old BC AD, dating of time. BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. What do those get replaced with?
After the Common Era and before Common Era.
BCE, before the Common Era, and Common Era. But what delineates the Common Era? It's still the BC. It's Christ. There's nothing else that we don't say, before CA, Caesar Augustus, and after CA, Caesar Augustus. We could. It's pretty close. Augustus' death date is pretty close to Christ's birth date, okay? But we don't do that, interestingly. So the BCE is just it's usually the same demarcation point, in other words, okay? So Bede writes this. What's his purpose for writing this? Why does anybody write a history?
The people who come after?
Yeah. To know their history, to know their heritage. Bede thinks it's fairly important people should know where they come from, how they got to be the way they are. You don't understand how you get to be the way you are simply by understanding your own day and time. You got to look to the past, okay? Because the past is present in all of us. We might not want it to be, but it is, okay? So he's giving this for the people to understand their past. Problem, what language does he write in? Latin. How many people, Bede's day, know Latin?
Only the rich.
No, not even only the rich. The church, the clergy. Most people don't know Latin. And even then, you go 100 years after Bede, 150 years after Bede, and even many of the members of the church, the clergy, they only know the Latin that they've memorized for the rituals, but they don't even understand what they're saying. Alfred the Great talks about this, okay? But it does get translated into Old English, so that anybody who could read Old English, which again is not very many, okay, would be able to read this, okay? Alfred, who comes after Bede, Alfred has this translated into English and has it sent various places, so that you have a copy of Bede in the major, monastic libraries and such, okay? So Bede writes this, and we're going to pick up, as I said, in the syllabus, with Abbas Hild, okay? Section 4 on page 51. Abbas Hild's pretty important. She's a princess, first of all, who takes on a monastic habit. That is, she takes on the role of a monastic. She becomes a nun, essentially, and rises up, becomes abbess, etc. But she is/could have been royalty with all that that entails, but she gives all that up for the church, etc. Okay? So, pick up 51. In the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, 680, Hild, the most devout servant of Christ, abbess of the monastery at Whitby. You can go to Whitby today, but it's destroyed. It's destroyed not because of the Viking invasions I talked about in that previous lecture. It's destroyed, well, partly the Vikings do attack it, but it's destroyed because of Henry VIII, which we'll talk about later. Idiot. He writes, she departed on the 17th of November after having performed many heavenly means. She died, okay, to receive the rewards of the heavenly life at the age of 66. So, she spent her first 33 years living most nobly in the secular habit, that is, not as a nun. More nobly dedicated the remaining half to our Lord in the monastic life. She's noble kin, being the daughter of Hereric, nephew to King Edwin, blah, 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 blah. So, she gives up the secular habit. She serves God alone. She withdraws to the kingdom of the East Angles. If you watch that lecture, I think I had a map in there at some point. And there is a map in the back of the book. If you look at a map of England, you got the little bump that sits off the side. That's East Anglia. Why? Because that's the area where the Angles of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes settled. West Anglia, you don't have a West Anglia. It's just the East Midlands is where the Angles sits. The west part, okay, is where the Mercians are. They're called Mercians because they live in the borderlands, the marches, or marshes you can even call, but it's not marshland. Okay? It's the borderlands of Wales and farther north. So she sets up her monastery there, and Bede goes on. She's made abbess in the monastery. I'm going to skip over a bunch. Let's see here. Outstanding piety. Actually, I am going to talk about another part of Bede too. Shoot, I forgot about that entirely. Let's pick up with bottom of 53. I'm going to do Caedmon, and then I'm going to go back to an earlier part. Completely forgot about it, but it's really important. It's the coming of Christianity. Bottom of 53. In her monastery was a certain brother specially marked by the grace of God. This is the very last thing on the right-hand paragraph. Who used to make pious poems. Okay? Who is this? This is Caedmon. And we're told about Caedmon. Notice, he was a herd at the monastery. That is, a herder. He kept control of the cows and such. He lived, page 54, second paragraph, in the secular life until he was well advanced in years. We don't know how well advanced. We don't know how old Caedmon was when he received the gift of poetry. But he was old. And so Bede tells us this story. One night, while Caedmon is in the hall of the monastery, the refectory where they eat and where they pass around the ale and the harp and sing, Caedmon's sitting there, they've eaten, and now it's time for the revelry in the evening, which another author, I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, Alcuin of York said you shouldn't do. Okay? Alcuin was a later writer, and he wrote a letter to one of the abbots in England, and he kind of castigated this abbot because word had reached Alcuin that the monastics are sitting there after dinner and they're listening to tales of Germanic gods. And he has this famous line, what is Christ to do with ENGL? What does Jesus have to do with ENGL? ENGL is a Germanic god. You're going to hear him referred to when we read Beowulf. Okay? And what Alcuin means by that is, you guys are all men of God. What are you doing talking about these pagan Germanic gods? You should be listening to the Psalms being read, the lives of the saints, homilies, things like that, while you're eating. In other words, no talking. The typical monastic way was everybody gets their meal, sits down at their table, and they silently eat while one person stands and reads aloud. And the reading aloud is something that is supposed to be beneficial for your soul. Okay? Instead, they're hearing Beowulf or something like that. Alcuin doesn't like that. So, here back in Caedmon's story, after the dinner and everything, they're letting off some steam. They're having some fun. And so they pass around the ale cup. And some of these are, cups like this. And we have some that survive that are like these, almost like buckets, that you hold with two arms like this. And you put the rim of the bucket up your mouth and you swallow the ale. Okay? And that passes from this person to this person to this person. And what follows is the harp comes. So you drink a bit, lose a little bit of your inhibitions, and then you sing a song. This isn't like Bob Dylan or, somebody singing a song today. It's kind of like Caedmon's hymn. But it's a pagan Germanic song. And that's what all this will be about in a moment. So, Caedmon sees the harp coming his way. And Bede tells us he does what? He gets up and leaves. Why? He can't sing. Can't sing doesn't mean he can't hold a tune. It means he can't do this. He doesn't know these rules. No. Maybe he can't sing either. Maybe he can't hold a tune. So, he sees the harp coming. He gets up, and he goes off and goes out to the stable. Chucks on the cows, stretches out to rest, falls asleep. A person appeared to him in his sleep, salutes him, that greets him by name, doesn't, salute him like that, and says, Caedmon, sing me something. Notice, it's not, Caedmon, please sing me something. Caedmon, will you sing me something? It's imperative. It's a command. Caedmon, sing to me. Caedmon, I can't sing, that's why I left. The man says, nevertheless, you must sing to me. Okay, what do you want to hear? Sing about the beginning of created things. In other words, sing about creation. Okay? Creation. At that, Caedmon immediately began to sing verses which he had never heard before in praise of God. So it's like the guy says, sing of creation. Smacks him on the head. And Caedmon suddenly, belts out songs about creation. And here's what he sings, Bede writes. Whose general sense is this. Why whose general sense is this? Because Caedmon's writing in Latin. Bede is writing in Latin. Caedmon sings this in Old English. We ought now to praise the maker of the heavenly kingdom, the power of the creator and his counsel, the deeds of the Father of glory, and how he, since he is the eternal God, was the author of all marvels, and first, as almighty guardian of the human race, created heaven as a roof for the sons of men, and then the earth. That's the sense, Bede says. Why? It's not the actual order of the words. For poetry, no matter how well composed, cannot be literally translated from one language into another without losing much of its beauty and dignity. There is Bede telling us in the 21st century why it's important to learn a foreign language. If you want to read Victor Hugo, learn French. If you want to read Dostoevsky, learn Russian. If you want to read the Mahabharata, learn Sanskrit. Why? Because everything else you read of those languages in English is an approximation. You want to learn, or you want to read Caedmon's hymn in its original, you have to say either learn Latin or learn Old English. Because right after Bede wrote this, it was then translated into Old English, so that we have Old English versions of Caedmon's hymn, but they're based upon Bede's Latin. We don't have Caedmon's hymn in his own handwriting. 150 years ago, we thought we did. Talk about that in a moment. Okay? So, you want to learn, you want to get the real gist of a poem, learn it in its native language. You want to read the real Beowulf. I used to teach Beowulf at the graduate level. Taught a semester of Old English, so they learn the language, and then they do Beowulf. All 3,182 lines, translated by the students into English. It's the hardest thing graduate students ever did in English. Okay? But when they accomplish that, it's like, that is a major accomplishment. Because once they started reading Beowulf in the original, and they would cheat, because everybody does this, by using translations to help them with their own translation, once they developed a facility with the language, they started saying, but so-and-so says, but that's not what the poem really says. And I'm like, bingo. That's why it's important to learn the original. So, Caedmon wakes up, remembers everything he had sung in his dream, soon added more verses in the same manner. In the next morning, he goes to the steward of the abbess of the monastery. He tells the steward what happened to him. The steward takes him to the abbess. The abbess says, tell me what happened to you. He tells her again. He sings the song. And so what does the abbess do? Praise Jesus. No. She follows the advice of St. John the Beloved in the first epistle of John, where he says, test the spirits. See whether or not they are from God. How do they test whether or not the spirit is from God? They want to prove this thing is really of divine origin, not demonic origin. So they have Bede go off with a couple of priests, have Caedmon go off with a couple of priests, and the priests tell him some biblical stories. Again, he's illiterate. He can't read. He can't go get a copy of the Bible and read them. So they tell him these stories. And they say, come back tomorrow with these stories composed into poetry. Yeah, no pressure there. Because if he doesn't come back tomorrow, what's the implication? Not of divine origin. And you don't want to be in those shoes. Okay? But he does come back the next day, and he's composed poems based upon the stories. Caedmon now has it made. He no longer has to tend herd. Now his new job is compose biblical poetry. So he spends a lot of time with the priests who tell him stories. They tell him stories about the Exodus. And he composes poems about the Exodus. They tell him stories about the crucifixion. He composes poems about the crucifixion. They tell him stories about the three youths in the fiery furnace. Daniel in the lion's den. He composes poems. Okay? Lives to a ripe old age and dies. 19th century, there's a manuscript that is thought to be Caedmon's poems. The manuscript was called the Caedmon manuscript. It's now called by its shelf mark and where it resides. It's Junius 11, and it's in Oxford. It's named Junius after one of the owners of the manuscript who owned it in the 17th century. And this manuscript has poems that sound an awful lot like all the poems Caedmon wrote, which is why it was called the Caedmon manuscript. But nobody today believes Caedmon wrote any of the poems that are in this manuscript. They're all ascribed to one, a much later date. A lot of people don't even believe Caedmon actually lived, that this is all a fiction of Bede's to create an account of the beginning of Christian poetry in England. See, this is the important thing about Caedmon. Prior to Caedmon, all of this stuff was only used for secular Germanic poetry. It was only used to communicate pagan Germanic ideas. Caedmon comes around, according to Bede, And he turns it all now towards Christian purposes. So now it can be used for more eternal purposes. Okay? It can be used for proselytizing. That is, you can use poetry as a means of conversion, which we'll talk about when we get, for example, to the dream of the rood in a few days. Okay? And it's really the first time any of the native European languages is used for Christian purposes. Italian and French don't get used for a couple hundred years after this. I mean, if you want to consider Greek a European language, which it is, yeah, Greek was used for Christian purposes, but that's because the New Testament was written in Greek. So, I mean, it's the language of the New Testament and such. Okay? So, the poem that Bede, that Caedmon writes, you have there on page 55. And it survives, as I said, there are many copies, and it survives in different dialects of Old English. The one that you have here is kind of classical West Saxon. There are earlier forms of Old English, like Northumbrian, which I think there might be a sample of in their introduction. So this is what it sounds like in Old English. Nu schulan hurjan heaven reaches word. Mehtoris machta on des modjethank. Werk wuldervader, swahi wundria was. Eche dichten or astelda. He erst shop, elde bernum, havent hrova, hali shipind. Tha midniard mankinis word. Eche dichten efterteda, firm folgan, frail and michty. Okay? If you know German, it's got a very Germanic sound to it. Okay? So, Nu Schulen Herian, Nu, modern English, now. Notice, what's the difference?
It's just the vowel.
It's the vowel sound. Okay? The vowel sound lengthens. You can draw the vowels like this. Okay? The vowel in eat is represented with a lowercase I. Okay? The vowel in father is like a lowercase a down here. Again, e, on this side, and then aw is, is supposedly there's a difference between father and park. I don't hear it, but supposedly there is. And then aw is in bought. Okay? If you pronounce it that way, you're caught. Faulkner. Okay? And then o, and then and oo. And then oo, represented like this, is in moon. If you elongate that, it becomes ow. If you elongate this, it becomes I. If you listen to that sound, it starts with this and becomes this. Okay? This all happens, this shifting. Okay? These vowels all change in what's called the great vowel shift. We don't know why it occurs, but it occurs slowly from about 1400 to about 1700, where all the vowels, the long vowels of Old English kind of move one position. So this goes like this, goes like this, goes like this, and this one all up here. You can represent it this way. I'm going to write a phonetic transcription of it, and then I'll write it differently. And what this says is, modern English, my feet take, so do ours. Middle English and Old English, mi feet ak, sa do ours. Okay? So when you see an oo sound in Old English, that sound is going to become this sound in modern English. When you see an O in Old English, that's going to become an oo in modern English. So modern English, modern English cow would be Old English what? Cool. And if you go to northern Scotland, you'll still hear some Scots talk about the Highland Cools, cows. Okay? So, oo, as in moon, Old English, moon. Okay? So, comes from saw. So wherever you have that O today, stone, stun, Old English, S-T-A-N-E becomes stone, Old English, hung, modern English, home. Okay? So those vowels all shift. They jump up one full length. So, go back. Nu, shulan, herion, nu, now. It elongates up to the diphthong. Shulan, what word do we get from that? Pretty close. This is a case where the vowel doesn't elongate that way. But we still have the sh and the oo. Shall. Now shall, herion's a word we don't have anymore, but it's praise. How do we know it's plural? The O-N ending on shulan indicates we, or plurality. Now we shall praise, heaven reach us. Two parts of that word. The first part is pretty easy, right? Heaven reaches. Where do we still have part of that word today? Very seldomly used, unless you're Catholic. Bishop Rick. It's the place where a bishop rules. Or if you're a historian, or if you study World War II history, the Third Reich. The Third Reich is the third kingdom of what?
Germany.
Rome. That's what Hitler thought. It's going to be the third Rome. First Rome. What was the second one? Charlemagne, Holy Roman Empire. Okay? Only this one's going to last 1,000 years. 5. So, now shall we praise heaven, kingdoms. How many of you read the Harry Potter novels? Where is Harry born? Where must Harry go back to in book 7? Godric's Hollow. Godric. Reach, kingdom, place of rule of God. God. God's little kingdom. Okay? Kind of interesting there. Heaven reaches where? We still have that word where today. It's just spelled a little different and pronounced a little different. Ward. As in warden. Heaven, kingdom's guardian or warden. Metros completely drops off the face of the earth. Okay? Machta, metros, the measurers. Machta, might. Okay? And his modyathunk, completely gone. Okay? His mind, that's mod, yathunk, thoughts. How many of you have read Lord of the Rings? A couple of you. Where do you see the word thunk in Lord of the Rings? Part. It's part of a word. 2 towers. Or thunk.
It's the Ents, isn't it?
Yeah, it's what the Ents destroy. It's Saruman's tower in Isengard, the Tower of Orthanc, or beginning, the beginning thought. Okay, is what that stands for. So werk, it's pretty close. Work, Wooldorf drops out. The Wooldorf Vader. Vader's pretty easy. Father. By the way, Darth Vader. What's his name mean?
Darth Father.
Darth Father. What does Darth mean?
Darth.
If you have a Darth, or more correctly pronounced, dearth of something, You have none of it. You have a lack of it. Lack father. And Anakin Skywalker what?
Lack the father.
Had no father.
That must have made that movie really, really obvious, but that whole really, really obvious for old English.
Yeah, I mean, if you knew Dutch, because Vater is Dutch, or Vader is Dutch essentially. Okay? So werk wilder vader, swa he wonder je was. Swa, we still use this word every day, but we don't use the W, and the ah has become this one.
So,
Oh, so.
so,
We just dropped the W off. Okay? So he wondra of wonders, of each one of wonders, the last drops off. Echa drichten, Echa is a word we no longer use, drichten is a word we no longer use. Echa eternal, drichten Lord. Okay? Or, no longer used, beginning, estalda, no longer used. So what word do we use instead of or? Well, I said beginning or foundation. Beginning is Native Germanic, foundation is Latin. Yes.
But isn't or like, very similar to origin, the word origin?
Yeah, which is Latin.
Yeah.
But this isn't. This is Germanic. Okay? But Germanic and Latin are cognate languages.
Yeah.
They're brother-sister languages. They have a common origin. Take my History of the English Language course next spring, and we'll talk a lot about Indo-European, which is the parent language of German, Latin, Greek, Hindi, Sanskrit, Russian, all Slavic languages, all the European languages, with a couple of exceptions, Hungarian and Lithuanian. They're not Indo-European. We don't know kind of why they are where they are. Okay, and Basque. Basque is a non-Indo-European language. Okay. So, werk wilder vader, Swahili wonder yes, Echerichten, that is eternal Lord, the beginning created. He, very little change in the pronouns over the 1,500 years of English. He, erist, ere you go, before you go, only this is the beforest. So how beforest do you get? First. He first showed. O-A, shaped. He first shaped. Another word for God used in Old English, 2 lines, second half line after that, sheped, is shippen, shaper. What is a poem? What word does it come from? It comes from Greek. Poesis. Poesis simply means to make. A poem is simply something made. This is a poem. But we use conventions that say, no. A poem is what? Something shaped out of, not plastic, words. So what's the difference between a poem and The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky? That's a novel, not a poem per se. So we get more and more conventions. A poem is something that has meter and rhythm. It may or may not have rhyme, whereas a novel is written in prose, etc. Okay? But a poem, strictly speaking, is just something made, something shaped. Okay? So he first shaped Yalda Bernum. Bernum you still have in some varieties of English. Louis Bairns, Scottish. The little ones. For the children of men, okay, or for men's sons if you want. Heaven, there's that word again, it's pretty close. Tohrova. Heaven.
above us?
Close. What is always above us if we are in a building?
Ceiling?
Other word for that. Looked at from the top down. Ceiling is from inside the building looking up. The roof, which is from looking from the outside down. Heaven as a roof. Notice again what it implies. God is outside the roof, looking down. Okay? Highly shipping.
It's like we dropped the H and just gave it that weird sound.
Yeah, we dropped the H. Why? Take my history in Middle English class in the Middle Ages. We do this thing called consonant simplification. Consonant cluster simplification. The English language doesn't like a bunch of consonants altogether. So we start to drop them off. Make it easier to pronounce words. For example, modern English, nut used to be hnutu. Road, hrad. We had a lot of at the beginning of words. Why do we drop all those sounds off?
Because it's so difficult.
Okay, that's one reason. Here's another reason. In the later Middle Ages, after the Norman Conquest, what language had a big influx into English? French. French doesn't have a at the beginning of words, right? And you have this word in French. How do you pronounce that? How do you pronounce? How do you spell it? Not hors d'oeuvres. Or dudes. Or. Okay, all those H's, they don't. French can't say it or hear it. Well, you had all these English words that begin with that, and they just drop off. Interestingly, when we get to Beowulf, Beowulf has a major character whose name begins with H. Okay? In the manuscript, every modern editor amends the name to drop the H. Everyone. The guy's name is Hunferth. And it gets amended to Unferth. Why? Because in the manuscript, every time the name shows up, it needs to alliterate with another vowel. And yet we have other poems where it's pretty clear there are silent H's. Because words alliterate, okay, with the vowel on the words that begin with H, and there are other vowel words in there. So, he first shaped for the children of men heaven as a roof. Heilig, we don't have that in English, but we still see that word in German. Heilige Geist, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Shippen, the Holy Shaper. Tha Middenyard, there's your Tolkien, Middle Earth. The middle yard, what that literally is. Mankennis, man, that's pretty clear. Kinnis. Hamlet will say about his uncle, he is a little less kin than kind. Mankind. The kin, your relations. Mankind's, again, warden. H addicted, eternal Lord. Notice that's the exact same line. Just gets repeated. Why? It's called a formula. We'll talk about that later. He, later, created Ferum Folden, okay, the earth for men. Ferum, if you know Latin, rear, or if you know horror stories, werewolf, weir, okay. Freya Allmächtige, God Almighty. Freya, however, is a name. It's a Germanic pagan name. Okay? So, here's the rules of this kind of poetry. This is what Caedmon sees at heart when he's going, I can't do this. Every line is divided into two half lines. Okay? Nu Schulen Helion, Helen each word. But they're not in the manuscripts. When you look at these things in manuscript, it's all written out like this. Just looks like prose. In fact, there's no punctuation either.
Oh, jeez.
Okay? And very few capitals. It's just, if you look at, manuscripts of classical Latin or Greek, it's just like scribbles. No paragraph breaks, nothing. Stanza, nothing. Okay? So, divided into two half lines that are referred to as A and B. So you have 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, etc. Each half line has two stressed syllables. So there's two stressed syllables in the first half line, two stressed syllables in the second half line. So somewhere in here, you got two stresses, and somewhere over here, you have two stresses. All right? Third, this is where it starts getting difficult. The first stressed syllable of the second half line is what determines the alliteration. Well, who came up with that crazy blank idea?
Pagans.
Notice, you got to look to the second half line to figure out the alliteration. Nushul and Harion, heaven reaches where? Where are the only two alliterating sounds? Right? Because doesn't alliterate with sh or n or v. So those two alliterate. That's the key right there. So you've got two now, right? So there's got to be another stressed syllable on this side and another stressed syllable on this side. So how do you know where they are if you don't know Old English? This is the hardest thing to really follow as a graduate student learning Old English, which is why I did not spend much time on it with my students.
The second one?
Okay, well, I mean, one thing we know, and this applies to most languages, okay, you usually don't put much emphasis on conjunctions, prepositions, articles. Those are parts of speech that indicate kind of relationship, but they're not the ones carrying the meat of the meaning. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Those are what carry the meat of the meaning of something. So, verb, okay, noun. Well, there's only got to be one more stressed syllable here. Usually, that stressed syllable is not going to be the remaining syllables in a compound word like heaven reaches. Now, there is what's called secondary stress. In other words, the vun in heaven, the vun is unstressed. How do we know that? English is a Germanic language. Germanic languages stress the first syllable. It's just something native to them. All of them do. Okay? So, in a native Germanic word, you would tend to stress that first syllable, with some exceptions, if the first syllable is a prefix, like be in believe. The be there is a prefix. The real meat of that word, the stem of that word, is in the leaf part. So it's believe. It's not believe. Okay? It's not Attila the Hun. It's Attila the Hun. All right? So, heaven reaches. Here you have what's called the secondary stress. These two combine. Werd. But we still have this part. What is new? It's an adverb, right? Now, shulan. It's a verb. Which one's more important? Shulan. And you will see different scholars scan this differently. Some will say it should be there. Some will say it should be there. Now shall we praise. Okay? What about this one? This one's a lot easier. Ma. Meh todes mahta under bodjafunk. On and drop it. It's not important. Preposition, yeah, it's kind of important. But is that right? It's not right. Why? Fourth syllable never alliterates. Fourth stressed syllable never alliterates. This would be the fourth, unless you're doing modya thunk, or is it on his modya thunk? Again, different scholars will do that differently. But this is usually taken to be the third one because of these two. So it's usually that. Modya thunk, and then those two are unstressed. Where wundervater, swahe wundra, yeah, class. This is on the Excuse me. This is on the huh, not the what. Right? You're not going to have to do this in an exam. But you do need to know this. So first syllable stress of the second half line determines the alliteration. If you're really nerdy, you want to know this is called the Havestav, or the head stave. For the fourth stress syllable never alliterates. We don't know why. We've not found, the quote unquote rule book. We do have a book that actually talks about these rules and stuff, but it was written in like the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, and in Norse. Okay? It's just, these have been determined as the rules on an analysis of surviving Germanic literature, written in Old Saxon, Old High German, Middle High German, Old English, some stuff in Frisian. Right? So, the first stress syllable of the first half line must alliterate with the first. No, sorry. I knew I should have put that. One stress syllable of the first half line must alliterate with that third stress syllable. At least one of the stress syllables in this half line has got to alliterate with that third stress syllable in the second half line. Okay? Any vowel alliterates with any other vowel. That's why you see H or A. All three of those alliterate. Right? And then lastly, generally pronouns, nouns, adjectives, adverbs may alliterate. Conjunctions, prepositions, articles, usually they don't. If they do, that's usually a poet struggling. I mean, generally that doesn't happen at all. Okay, I said I wanted to go back for a moment, and this is why this is important. Pages 48 and 49. 48 and 49 talks about the coming of Christianity and King Edwin, and how Paulinus comes and preaches the word of God to Edwin. This is after St. Augustine, not St. Augustine, the guy who wrote the City of God, but the other St. Augustine who brings Christianity in 597. This is after him. This is Christianity coming to more northern England and stuff. And Edwin had a dream, and the dream said, if this happens, follow it, and it happens. Okay? And Paulinus comes, tells them the gospel, and we're told, right-hand column, second to last column on page 48. When the king heard these words, he answered that he was both willing and bound to accept the faith which Paulinus taught, but that he would confer about it with his chief men and counselors, so that if they agreed, they might altogether be cleansed. Paulus says that's fine. King did as he said. So the king holds a meeting of what is called his Witan. Okay? His counselors. Think of this as the president's cabinet. And Paulinus explains the gospel, so to speak, to the Witan. And Coifi, the chief of the pagan priests, says to Edwin, "Consider, O king, this new doctrine that is being preached to us. For I say to you truly that as far as I can tell, the religion we have practiced until now has no virtue in it." He doesn't mean virtue as in goodness or morality. He means power. Because that's what virtue really means. Power. So this is the chief priest of the pagan Germanic religion held by Edwin saying, our religion is a sham. None of your people has devoted himself more diligently to the worship of our gods than I. And yet there are many who receive greater favors and greater honor from you than I do, and are more prosperous in all their undertakings. Now, you can read this a couple of ways. One of these is he just slapped his king upside the head and said, I am the greatest practitioner of our faith, and yet I have received zilch from your hands. This is why I know our gods are no good. Because if our gods were any good, then you would treat me better. Okay? If the gods had any power, they would have helped me more readily, since I have been more careful to serve them. Follows, therefore, that if on examination these new doctrines which are now preached to us are found to be better and more effective, we should accept them. And another of the king's men says, king, it's kind of like this. And he creates a word picture, a story. He says, this is what life is like. You have a bird flying through the storm. And the bird comes through the window of the hall. And there's another window out here, and the bird flies out. He says, when the bird's out here, we don't know where the bird is, but it's flying through the winter and the storm and the hail, etc. And it comes in the hall, and what does it experience? Beautiful passage. This is how the present life of man, O king, seems to me in comparison with that time which is unknown to us. What is that time which is unknown to us? Before and after. Where we come from, where we go to. It's as if you're sitting in your feasting hall with your aldermen and thanes in wintertime, good fire burning in the middle of the hall, all inside is warm, while outside the winter storms of rain and snow are raging, and a sparrow flies swiftly through, entering in at one door and quickly flying out at another. That is, the sparrow comes in, notice, it doesn't stop. It comes in and flies right back out. That's what our lives are like. Our lives are the brief time in the hall, where there's some laughter, there's some revelry, there's some joy, there's some warmth. While he is within, the winter storms cannot touch him. But after the briefest moment of calm, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, out of the winter, and back into it again. So this life of man appears just for a moment. Of what went before or what is to follow, we know nothing at all. We who? We practitioners of pagan Germanic belief. Why? Pagan Germanic belief doesn't say anything about what's before. It does say something about what comes after. Anybody know what pagan Germans believed about quote-unquote life after death? Valhalla. What is Valhalla?
Basically a place where warriors die on the battlefield and they get sent there to fight with the gods.
Yep. Val comes from Val, which is slaughter. It's the slaughter hall. It's where those slaughtered in battle go off after they die, and they hang around there with Brunhild and the other Valkyries, those who carry the Val, the slaughtered, from the field to the hall, and they sit there and they party for quote-unquote eternity until what happens?
Ragnarok.
Ragnarok. Not at all like Marvel version.
Yeah, a little bit worse.
Not Thor and Ragnarok. Okay? What happens at Ragnarok? It's the final battle between good and evil. Who wins?
No one.
No, that's not true. Evil wins. Chaos reigns. The frost giants defeat. The frost giants, the elves, Loki, defeat Odin, Thor, Freya, Freyr, Sif, all of them. Turn off the lights when you leave. That's the end of the story. In other words, what kind of ending to human existence? We all march off to, be with Jesus? No. We all end up in a place of bliss and happiness, the Greek Elysian fields? No. Darkness reigns supreme. Not very hopeful, right? Germanic is one, I think, of only two Indo-European languages that lacks a present tense. None of the Germanic languages have a true present tense. If we want to indicate the future in talking, what must we do? What must we use? We have to use what's called a modal auxiliary. We have to use two verbs. Latin, just one. You just add an ending on that indicates futurity. We have to say, I will go to the store, or I shall go to the store. We can't say, I go, ending to the store. We could say, I went to the store. Or the boy talked, the boy talks, the boy is talking, the boy will talk. No, we've got two tenses.
We could also say I'm going to the store.
Yeah, that's present and futurity, but it's still, in order to indicate any kind of futurity, you have to have two verbs. Okay? One of the reasons supposed for that, by some scholars, is because of this belief system. You have no future. There's nothing positive about it. And therefore, the Germanic mindset, when German as a language was forming, kind of just wiped it off. Because everything is where? Today or yesterday. There's living for now. There is no living for tomorrow, because you don't know tomorrow's coming. I mean, Fenris Wolf gets unchained, all bets are off. If the Ermengarde, the ocean serpent, is loosed, that's it. Now, in some recensions of the Germanic myth, there is then a rebirth. Balder is reborn. Earth is made new. And some mythologists have argued that that's because of the influence of Christianity. That even the basic German myths have an element of Christianity at their root, such as Odin hanging on a tree for 9 days to gain what? Wisdom. That's Christ on the cross. Right? Because Germanic, as a language and as a mentality, you could say, probably dates from no earlier than 200 BC and possibly as late as 200 AD. And therefore it could entirely be not based upon, influenced by it. I saw a hand up, I thought. Did I? Okay. So, Koifi says this, and then he says what? If this new doctrine, this other priest says this, if this new doctrine contains anything more certain, it seems right that we should follow it. Well, what does Christianity say? We know how it began, right? In principio. That's how Genesis begins in Latin. In the beginning, God. That's it. There's no darkness, etc. It's not rising out of slime. And then, how does it end? Flip a few pages in your Bible, and you get to the end of Revelation, and
God wins.
God wins. That's it. And, depending on where you fall, what you... Don't mean a pun there on the fall, but on how you live your life, etc., you end up with the blessed or you end up with the unblessed. Pretty clear. Things are black and white, so to speak. And there's not a lot of doubt. There's not is there a third way? It's, this or this. Koifi says, yeah, I want to hear more what Paulinus has to say. Okay? And then the king ordered Paulinus to speak, and Koifi hears Paulinus and says, I've long realized that our religion is worthless The more diligently I sought the truth in our worship, the less I found it. Now I confess such truth shines forth clearly in this preaching. What is essentially at stake here? I'm not talking about their eternal souls and all that. You can talk about that if you want. What's being presented? Two different stories. Two narratives. And they're saying, which story do you like better? Do you like the one that ends in death, darkness, and despair? Or do you like the one that possibly ends in the wedding feast of the Lamb? You talk about Valhalla as being a good place. Valhalla is only a temporary good place. Because you got to go back ultimately and fight and lose. The wedding feast of the Lamb, however, which we'll see depicted in other ways in a couple other poems, heaven is depicted as what? The kegger of all keggers, the party of all parties, the revelry of all revelry forever. So, death, darkness, and destruction, or eternal bliss. Yeah, I think most people are going to go, even if it's not true, I'm going to go for door number 2 on the possibility that it is. And we know there was an Anglo-Saxon king mentioned on the previous page, Radwald, who did just that. He became a Christian, and then sometime before he died, he said, I'm not so sure. So he built a Christian church, and next to it he built a pagan shrine. And he served at both. Thinking, I'm going to cover my bets. If God's not real, Jesus isn't real.
Didn't he just broke the law of piety?
Well, yeah, you kind of think, I don't know about God or Thor, but you would think one of them would, the Old Testament God says, I'm a jealous God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So that kind of, but Thor might go, it's okay. I understand you're human, you're frail, etc. Don't worry about it. Kind of like the old Roman. It doesn't matter what you believe, just, as long as you acknowledge me also. Okay? Radwald did that, apparently. And then died. Who knows what he discovered. Okay, we'll stop there. So for Tuesday, I think we have The Wanderer. Yes. Just one poem, about 115 lines or so. Hopefully you'll like it. I think it's one of the most beautiful things written. But we'll do that. Questions, comments?